Yeah, Erin, I would think we can make a start. I would suggest if I can share the screen. Can you see that?
Yes, that's perfect.
Is that okay? That's great. So yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Gary Wilburn, and I'm pleased to welcome Paul Walton from the National Park Authority this morning to talk about natural capital, a subject that Paul and I are passionate about, one of many things, but particularly close to our heart on the basis that we were two of the founding members of the Green Halo in the New Forest, which is a much wider region, and please take a look at that on our websites, various websites. I'm pleased to be able to say I also sit on the board of Future South, and this is a Future South organised event this morning. I'm lucky to be the only person that sits on the Future South board and the Green Halo steering group. So here to discuss and take questions on the subject of natural capital, something that is extremely important, putting a value on the living world as opposed to the constructed environment, and something that I'll talk about a little at the end of Paul's presentation in the context of a project I'm undertaking near Romsey, where I live. So Paul, hand over to you, and we'll probably take about 30 minutes, maybe a bit more, to go through the presentation and then take any questions via the...
Thank you, Gary, and good morning, everybody. It's great to see people here to take part in this webinar. In the presentation, I'm hoping to give what will be sort of probably the briefest of introductions to the concept of natural capital. I'm not a natural capital economist, but we'll look to try and explain how we at the National Park Authority and our partners, such as Gary mentioned, working with the Green Halo Partnership, how we are looking to develop the natural capital approach within this geographic region, and we'll probably refer to the region as the Central South or Southern Hampshire in a number of different ways throughout the presentation. But and Gary is operating the slides, so I'll occasionally give him a nudge, and occasionally, as he's just done, he'll do it by telepathy. So
you can see that map okay, I presume.
Yeah. Just a little bit about me before I go into some of the slides. I've spent 30 years roughly working in countryside conservation, particularly in protected landscapes. So that's areas of outstanding natural beauty, both in Sussex and in Cornwall. Spent a period of time with the National Trust, and for the last 7 years, I've been the head of environment and rural economy here at the New Forest National Park. And throughout that time, I guess the story around the environment has not been a great one. Loss and decline, and now with the climate change adding to the crisis of biodiversity loss, I think we've gone well past the point where things need to change. And I think that's being recognised in all sorts of areas. But particularly in terms of sort of the relationship between the economy and the environment, I think it's now accepted that there's no longer a case for jobs versus the environment. You can't trash the environment and expect people to be attracted to areas and for those areas to attract high quality jobs without paying attention to the quality of the environment around them. And one of the key things, as you'll see on the map here, the New Forest National Park here in, let's call it the Central South or Southern Hampshire, is a key part of the economic picture of our area. The slide highlights the area covered by the Solent Local Economic Partnership. And in a traditional view of the area, the economic qualities of the area are perhaps to the east, Southampton, Fareham, Gosport, Portsmouth, parts of the Isle of Wight, with the new forest providing the environmental interest, with perhaps sort of tourism or the visitor economy being regarded as the sort of priority or primary economic interest. This approach, of course, very much oversimplifies the situation, not least because it overlooks the quality of the other parts of the area, the marine environment of the Solent and the quality of the Isle of Wight landscape, for example. But it also sort of fails to address that more holistic approach that's needed to consider the natural environment as a foundation for the successful economy. So Gary, next slide, please. And this is very much sort of putting the environment at the heart of the economic approach is very much what natural capital is all about. Dieter Helm and the Natural Capital Committee have been leading this approach in the UK for around about the last decade. It's not without its detractors. The natural capital approach applies economic logic to the natural environment in the same way that companies must account for maintenance and replacement of assets and setting aside resources to address those costs associated with those before they can report profits, for example. Regarding the environment and its components as assets forces policymakers and others to consider the consequence of what might happen if an asset is damaged, the level of investment that is needed to maintain the asset as a functioning entity. So very much that is where government policy has been heading, and Dieter Helm has been at the forefront of that. He's been, or was, the chair of the Natural Capital Committee for a decade between 2011 and 2020, and he's also graced us with his presence within the Green Halo Partnership on a couple of occasions, talking to local business leaders here, talking to the LEP, considering how natural capital approach can be delivered in our local area. And when you hear him talk about this area, he very much sees Southampton and the Central South as very much a 21st century economic area, without the sort of difficulties of places like the Northern Powerhouse, excuse me, with their sort of 19th century buildings and their damage to the environment. This is the opportunity here very much for new investment, for new skills and green jobs, and taking the environment as a key component of that area. So we'll come on to that in a few minutes. But government policy, Gary, next slide. Very much sort of something of a journey. Originally, sort of the concept around natural capital in government policy terms was very much in the 2011 Natural Environment White Paper, which is called the Natural Choice. And it was that time that actually established the Natural Capital Committee. The White Paper stated that there's a duty of every generation to look after, of this generation to look after the next ones, to look after its natural capital, so that it can be passed on to future generations in better shape than the next. And this commitment came through a number of different strategies during the first or the second decade of the 2000s, and culminated in the 25-year environment plan that was published in 2018. Had something like 150 references to natural capital in the document, but also it identified the need for things like public money for public goods. So that has come through in the Agriculture Act, very much incentivizing landowners to manage the land, to manage natural capital for the future and for its environmental benefits, rather than having public subsidies for food production and the amount of land that people owned, regardless of what they did with it. The Environment Bill, which is promised, will look to place statutory targets around air and water quality, around carbon emissions and waste generation. So you can see that policy work is coming into, hopefully, fruition if it's solid enough and specific enough. And alterations to the climate change bill will also bring around targets to reduce emissions and mitigate climate change by increasing carbon sequestration. So very much the policy approach that was set out in those areas is starting to come to the fore. But what about natural capital itself? What does this mean? So Gary, next slide. And in many ways, the simplest sort of definition of natural capital is that it's often referred to as the things that nature gives us for free. But we also, that would have a tendency to undervalue it. So there's also the consideration that we need to think about it as an endowment for future generations. Importantly, it's not something that's produced, it's not made by people. There's different sorts of natural capital. There's the non-renewable natural capital, such as oil and gas, and renewables, and it's particularly the renewables that can give benefit forever, provided they're not overexploited. So examples of fish stocks, for example, air quality, how those can be managed so that natural limits can be not exceeded is key to thinking about natural capital. And in terms of the non-renewables, if it's going to be used up, and we've reached that point with the North Sea oil, for example, or gas stocks, and to some extent the horse has bolted on this, but how should we compensate future generations for the fact that they won't be able to use those? And in other countries that has been done. Somewhere like Norway has done a sovereign wealth fund, not something that we have done in the UK, but something that's being talked about now in the local area, particularly around something like the Solent Freeport, is how could there be local funding to address some of the development needs that areas like the Freeport and other areas will require, and can that be a future endowment fund for the natural capital of the area? So next slide, please, Gary. So very much natural capital, if natural capital can be regarded as assets, as I mentioned at the beginning. The assets on the left-hand side of that slide there, those things that happen for free, some of those benefits that come from those natural assets equally are for free. We don't have to do anything about those. Pollination, for example, can provide us with a whole range of resources. The opportunity that people can get for mental health benefits from just visiting the countryside. We don't have to add anything to that. There are well-known benefits for a walk in the country as far as mental health is concerned. And air quality, of course, air quality, much of that regulated by the natural environment. But it's when we start to add other forms of capital, whether that's human or social, to turn those natural assets and the services that they provide into the things that we as society want, whether that's food, fibre, clean water, and bringing those benefits in, whether it's jobs, materials, manufacturing, we know that damage will be done. And the aim of the natural capital approach is to try and identify where that damage that's inevitable through population growth, through infrastructure to accommodate that accommodation, such as houses, roads, schools and hospitals, they will all impact on the natural environment. So how do we begin to identify where that damage will be done, what will be the level of that damage, how can we compensate for the damage that's done, but also invest so that that future damage is not sort of just kept at a medium level, it is actually improving and enhancing the natural environment all the time. So next slide, please, Gary. So to some extent, very much it's developing a systems approach. And this is something that we've started to do within the National Park Authority. Some time back now, I think it was 2014, 2015, we started to do a ecosystem service mapping and trying to identify some of the benefits that the national park provides, not just to the environment in its entity, but to society at large, beyond the boundary. We started to map the rivers and streams, the role of the national park in flood protection, for example, to the wider area, the role of the national park in providing recreation, the role of the park in providing air quality function. And we started to map those benefits, those ecosystem services, and we identified that they very much extended beyond the boundary of the national park, that the benefits extended beyond the boundary, but also the impact of those, of what went on beyond the national park, thank you, were felt within the national park. So it was very much a case of those services that the national park provided. If they're going to be maintained, we need to look beyond our boundaries. We need to look to work with partners rather than just sort of draw the line, say that the natural environment of the national park is protected because it's national park status, we'll invest in that. Well, if the rivers upstream, that's going to impact on us downstream. If soil is being lost from the land around, that's going to impact on habitats and the ability of the wildlife of the national park to expand their ranges, to adapt to climate change and so on. So it's very much thinking, well, how do we begin to work with others to recognise the value of the national park to the environment, to the area as a whole. Next slide, please, Gary. So with that, we created the Green Halo Partnership, which was very much looking at how to develop the conversation with partners around natural capital, around acknowledging the benefit of having something like a national park on your doorstep. What is the role of that national park in the wider economic picture, the wider social picture of the Central South? And that is something that has very much come to the fore since we've all been in lockdown with the coronavirus pandemic over 2020. Very much the case that people have started to value the access to green space, the need to have that green space more locally. The changes when there were fewer cars around was indicative of, or indicated how quickly the air quality can change, light, people began to notice different things, noise quality and noise levels and so on. So that whole environment, and thinking, well, how can we bring the natural environment closer to people's lives? Very much that inequity around the fact that during COVID, it was clear that some people could access green space easily, some couldn't. And how do we spread the value of the national park and the wider environment into that wider area? So that was very much sort of the area that the Green Halo has been working in for the last 4 or 5 years, and both climate change focus now and the green recovery focus has been very much playing into that whole partnership that has been established over the 5 years that we were looking at ecosystem services, natural capital, and identifying ways in which other partners can join in that conversation. Next slide, please, Gary. And directly from working with partners within the Green Halo, Portsmouth and Southampton universities, Future South, and the Southern Policy Centre, a green print for green recovery for our Southern Hampshire area has been put forward, picking up on 5 key things that are on the slide in front of you there, and very much the first 3 elements are about natural capital, valuing that natural capital, ensuring that we can work with the natural capital to address issues of climate change, but also for society's health and well-being in terms of access to nature and the benefits that accessing natural environments and the world-class natural environments that we have in this region can be developed. And that work has extended. The green print has been adopted by the Partnership for South Hampshire authorities. There's a recognition that now what we have within this wider region, this natural capital resource that we have, needs to be carefully managed, needs to be invested in. So there's strong support for those key themes of the green print. In terms of something like the Freeport, which was announced, the intention for the Freeport announced in the budget in March, how can that Freeport become a green Freeport? How can the natural capital elements of that be properly assessed? And the Solent LEP has provided support around that for some of those businesses involved in the Freeport to develop their own natural capital baseline. We also now have a natural capital baseline for the national park, so that if we're looking to identify what the greatest areas of opportunity are, what the greatest areas for investment and benefits can be delivered, we need that baseline. We need to know what we're measuring. We need to know where the best bang for our buck will be if there's opportunities to invest in the natural environment in the future. Next slide, please, Gary. And very much from a national park perspective, we are trying to pick up that work. We're addressing it through a Net Zero with Nature program, looking at how the benefits of the national park can be invested in through things like green finance, organisations investing to offset carbon emissions, to address opportunities for biodiversity net gain. Environmental net gain is coming down the track, and there will be opportunities there to both address investment in the national park, but also in that wider area. We need to look as to how take that systems approach to develop green infrastructure, to identify and map where the best areas of opportunity for investment in the natural environment will be. Tree planting, for example, where is the best place to identify new opportunities for green space and tree planting. The greatest benefit from a natural capital perspective is to plant those trees near where people live so that people can access them quickly. You get the benefit of air quality, you get the benefit of recreation. Some 2 or 3 years ago within the national park, we worked with a number of companies and DEFRA to put together a pilot natural capital account to identify the value of the national park to this wider area. And top of the list was the role that the national park played in air quality improvements. That without the trees, without the vegetation of the national park, the air quality would be that much worse for that whole area of Southampton and so on. So if you start to address the natural capital value of that woodland, it's a lot more than perhaps the original thinking around the economic value of standing timber that can then perhaps through the addition of human capital be turned into building materials or firewood. There's a finite value for that, but that infinite value of investing in woodlands for air quality, for recreation quality and recreational opportunity, that's very much the natural capital approach. We're working with partners through the Green Halo Partnership and others to bring that about. And certainly within the South Hampshire area over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been that real sense that there's an understanding now that natural capital needs to be at the forefront of political thinking and certainly within the economic thinking of organisations such as the LEP, and their investment in the natural capital baseline is very much a sense that they are moving in the right direction. But it will require obviously a lot of engagement by individual businesses, individual companies. And Gary, I think I'm going to hand over now, Gary, to for you to explain a little how your company and others can do that investment work.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks very much. Yeah, so to try and give a demonstration of what Paul has just briefly explained, Paul and I don't make any excuse for the fact this is a huge subject area, and this is very much an introduction to natural capital discussion this morning. But a project that I've been working on with my colleagues at EP Projects for the last couple of years is Azure One at the World of Water sites just north of Romsey. These are some visuals that myself and the team have prepared of the project. And the project embraces the whole natural capital principle of improving and benefiting, bringing benefit to biodiversity net gain. The project is quite special in that it gives access to 170 acres of Hampshire Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust managed wetland. It's called Fish Lake Meadows. Some of you may be familiar with it. So this is a gateway to the Fish Lake Meadows Reserve and provides a visitor centre and a 3-story hide that I'll show you some visuals of in a moment. And the building is, we're in a beautiful location, working with the Wildlife Trust, well-being and public access to this wonderful environment. I can say, for one, because it's in a short walking distance of my home, I've been going here every week right throughout the whole lockdown the last couple of years. The nature focus of the project and the biodiversity focused and led nature of it. We are rewilding the 4.2 acres of the site of World of Water to effectively become part of this Fish Lake Meadows habitat, and are adopting an accreditation process which is referred to as building with nature. I can answer questions about that if anyone's interested, but as an accreditation, it says what it says on the tin. Building with nature, as you can imagine, is just that. And we decided to adopt that accreditation for the development and the buildings right at the outset. We're also targeting net zero carbon for the scheme. If we're able to achieve that, it would be the first of its kind in Hampshire. Using locally sourced materials, particularly timber, to construct the buildings, minimal impact of construction methods, and a biophilic design approach, meaning giving focus to natural ventilation, natural illumination, and context with the outdoors. And then also, to complement all of that, a very ethical and equitable funding arrangement to actually make the project happen. So you can see the 2 core buildings here, a 2-story element next to the car park, and a 1-story element nearest to the wildlife meadows. As you enter the buildings from the car park, the buildings are meant to be genuinely designed as being subservient to the surroundings. It's all about the surroundings and the rewilding and landscaping of the existing site. And you can see here on the plan its proximity to the wildlife reserve, and the circular element to the right-hand side of the plan is the hide, which I can show you here. And this bird hide, which gives controlled but fantastic visual access to the water meadows, but also restricts access. It is a control mechanism really for the Wildlife Trust in order to be able to manage this wonderful reserve. Some of you will be familiar with it, as I said earlier, and we've got all sorts of extraordinary species of birds and animals on the site, and we want to protect that as well as give public controlled access to it. So this whole accessibility for everyone to enjoy the well-being of this wonderful natural asset, guided and controlled, but very free and open at the same time. We felt just embraced the principles of what natural capital is about, and protecting as well as using this fabulous facility in an educative community and visitor attraction manner for Test Valley Borough Council, so that the site becomes a gateway coming south into Romsey and a gateway going north into the wider Test Valley. So hopefully that gives a feeling of a case study of what Paul and I and the team at Green Halo, and indeed our colleagues at Future South, are trying to introduce, trying to educate and facilitate the application of natural capital to a real life project. I think now I'll come off the share, and we can take any questions that anybody has raised, Erin. if there are any on the chat. I think probably there's a limited number of people on, and I've got no issue, Paul, with us actually speaking to people if anybody wants to open up their microphones and ask.
Yeah, there's quite a few questions in the chat.
If I may ask,
yeah.
what's planned in the future? Because obviously these projects evolve, and it's always helpful to know what's a vision, and how do you see that evolving?
Well, Paul and I are on the steering group of Green Halo. One of the most difficult things to establish is what the actual projects are, Diana. It is not a simple thing to highlight what those specific projects are. We've given support, endorsement, if you say, but obviously being Paul and the team being part of the National Park Authority, we've got to be very careful as to what we align ourselves with and what we do and don't. But there's a huge amount of input that the likes of Dieter Helm has been giving, and in terms of guidance to both small and substantive projects, such as Forley Waterside, the big project on Solent, which all of us are aware of and engaged with. I'm working on that with Aldred Drummond and the team. Paul, from your perspective within the National Park Authority, in terms of next steps and the things that you and Alison and the team are doing.
Yeah, so it's a good question, Diana, and good morning. I think where does it go next? It's certainly not finished by any means. The nature of the development that is planned for our region, and I notice in the chat that there's mention of sort of the larger housing developments and so on within the New Forest District Council area, and certainly around the city of Southampton. And how do we create an environment that provides the development that is needed for a growing population and for the infrastructure that's needed for a thriving economic base, while at the same time not just sort of trying to protect the existing environment, but actually improve it and extend it. And certainly one of the concerns that we had as a National Park Authority was taking that look ahead and thinking, well, if these plans come to fruition, we could potentially end up in a situation where, where almost the New Forest is encircled by development, with a sort of, look ahead 30 years and you'd have a sort of Central Park type environment around us. And that's the work that we did around our ecosystem service mapping showed that while the National Park is a big place in terms of an environment, it's not big enough in terms of to have fully functioning ecosystems and ecosystem services. So how do we protect those elements of the ecosystem services that feed in and out of the national park, and ensure that the development that is planned for the wider region doesn't ultimately strangle the national park and its ecosystem services. In doing so, by setting up the Green Halo Partnership, by beginning to bring businesses to a table that maybe weren't even, we weren't even thought about before, has definitely made progress. I don't think that somebody like the LEP, for example, would necessarily have invested in a natural capital baseline 3 or 4 years ago, but by being around the table and discussing that with us and working with partners like Gary, but Forley Waterside as well, and others, that are very much part of this recognition that the environment needs to be fully accounted for when the development process is taking place. I think the challenge remains as to what it will look like, but there's a lot more people around the table sort of aware of their responsibilities and wanting to do something about it now in the ways that Gary can demonstrate. So the vision is to keep working, to keep extending and getting investment into our natural environment in a way that probably wasn't possible 10 years ago. But with the new mechanisms that are coming forward now around natural environment investment, you may have read that the National Park recently got a grant from EA for the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. That will be working with landowners to see how we can work with them to ensure that they can manage their land and gain or be paid to manage their land to deliver environmental benefits, and that investment will come from private companies who are needing to show that they're offsetting and enhancing the environment through their future development processes. So the various building blocks are in place, and I would like to think that, you know, with the backup of some of the wider policy work that is coming from national government, but also the local investment and interest that has been put into the Green Halo partnership by a range of partners, that will stand us in good stead.
I appreciate you initially suggested that you weren't an economist, but I wondered if you had read the Dasgupta Report, which was published earlier this year. Quite fascinating to see how the case was made there, particularly on including natural capital with economic projections and modelling. Is that something that you've perhaps taken on board? Is that something you envisage? Because clearly there's quite a lot of change happening within the New Forest and its surrounding area. And this needs to be included urgently in order to make sure that we're promoting natural capital for the future, not just looking at the short-term gains and challenges we are facing now. Yeah,
well, I've certainly read the shorter version. I haven't read the
610 version.
the full version of the report. But I mean, I think it's interesting that you know, the terminology that's used in that report, the description of natural assets and so on, and moving that into a economic discussion is a very positive one. How we work with organisations that maybe haven't read it yet is certainly a challenge, and is something that, you know, certainly people on this call, if
Yeah, I think, Diana, you know, you can get gains in 2 or 3 years, but really we need a far less parasitic attitude to development, for want of a better description. We need we need people to adopt, including the house builder, attitude to investment and natural capital. When you're talking to people that get that whole life value, really has incredible benefit. And when you sit in boardrooms and talk with the investors and bankers and developers, it can actually become quite an easy sell. And whilst that's easy for me to say because that's my key focus, I think for all people in the commercial sector, it's coming thick and fast, and the whole dreadful COVID situation of the last 18 months has probably accelerated that in people's consciousness, and we've got to use that to very positive effect.
Thank you.
Anything else? Anybody else that would like to contribute or raise any questions?
there's a reference to data being collected in the chat. I think that might have been Diana again, but certainly within the national park, excuse me, we now have, as I mentioned, something like the natural capital baseline, and that's something that we are thinking, how do we go back to that on a regular basis? How do we monitor it? Some of the businesses and landowners that I mentioned also have their own natural capital baseline, so we will be working with them to see what their intention around that is. I suspect that as things like local nature recovery strategies come into play at the county level and other things, that data will be collected at a county level perhaps, but it's a new set of data, it's a new approach, or relatively, and so things like the current data collection services around the natural environment, such as the Hampshire Biodiversity Information Centre and others, the Wiltshire Record Centre and so on. I think there's a bit of work there to see how that data can be best kept, best accessed by those who want to see it, and how those organisations that have perhaps signed up to this sort of stuff are held to account over time to ensure that they're properly monitoring it and investing in it.
Yeah, and I think the monitoring, Paul, as we all agree, is absolutely vital, including very much in my world, buildings. If designs fail, we need to know why. And we've not been sharing historically in the construction sector the failings as well as the successes. Strange that, but it's an actual fact. Richard asked, are we putting in EV charging points at World of Water? Yes, we are. I've got a meeting tomorrow with a prospective tenant who is going to be organising an electric bike hire service that will be based at World of Water on site. As many as probably a fleet of about 150 cycles that then will be used as a tourism attraction for the Test Valley, for families, community, everybody to use. And we're probably looking somewhere in the region of 25 car and van charging points, and hoping that many of the tenants, the Wildlife Trust included, will be inspired to change their fleet of diesel vehicles to electric. And all that is in process and being discussed as we progress, as indeed it is for Paul in the New Forest. So I think we've just about covered all the various things that have been raised, not least to Diana, thank you very, very much. And any other things that anyone would like to raise before we close? I think, and obviously, if you email Erin, we'd be more than happy to answer any questions post presentation, and keep in contact. Paul and I are contactable and always happy to engage on this subject. Just suffices to say to Paul again, many, many thanks for your time and joining us for this Future South presentation. Erin's just put her email address on the chat for anyone that'd like to send any questions through. And thank you ever so much for everyone dialing in and for your time today. Great to discuss the subject, and hope to see you all again soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.